INGSA 2021, Montreal. Build back wiser knowledge, policy, and publics in dialogue. August 30th to September 2nd, 2021. 4 days, 4 themes. Science advice, society, trust, rebuild together.
Welcome back to the INGSA Horizon stage. Mami Mizutori is the head of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction and a special representative of the United Nations Secretary General. She joins INGSA 2021 to discuss the role that evidence and policy have in protecting our common future. Interviewing Mami Mizutori today is Robin Grimes, the United Kingdom's Ministry of Defense Nuclear Chief Scientific Advisor. Over to you, Professor Grimes.
We are really honoured to have Mami Mizutori here with us today, who, as you know, is the special representative of the UN Secretary General, as we just heard. Now, Mami, I've got lots of questions, but I wanted to start really today with some deceptively simple definitions, just to sort of get us into the right sort of frame here. So can I start and ask you to describe what risk, hazard, and disasters means, especially to you in your work?
Well, thank you very much, Robin, and thank you very much for inviting me to this very important event. That's a fundamental question and a great way to start our conversation. So we talk about risk a lot, especially now because we're in the middle of the COVID crisis. But what is risk? What are the components of risk? Risk is a combination of three things: hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. So hazard can be a hurricane, like Hurricane Ida, heat waves, floods, all that we experienced this summer. And the COVID virus is, of course, a biological hazard as well. But unless that hazard interacts with exposure, which is where we live, our villages, and even ourselves, and impacts on us, and also when there is vulnerability, let's say in the house we live, there are people who live with disability, senior people, then it doesn't become a risk, it doesn't become a disaster. And so what is important is that we need to manage risk. And what we mean by manage risk is that we mean that we need to reduce the impact of a hazard, the impact of exposure, impact of vulnerability. And if we manage to do this successfully, the risk does not turn into a disaster. But many times, unfortunately, we're not successful. So we see so many disasters that cost economic loss, but importantly, human lives and livelihoods.
That's really great. And that's a wonderful way to start us off. We've got this sort of definitions sorted out for us. One of the things that people often discuss is the difference between natural hazards and human-made hazards. Can you tell us what gives us which?
Right. So, if I may, many of you, and Robin too, you may have heard of the Paris Agreement, you may have heard of the Sustainable Development Goals, but maybe not the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, which is, let's say, the global blueprint for disaster risk reduction. How do we need to manage disaster risk? And in there, they say that there are hazards, as you say, natural hazards, man-made hazards, and other biological hazards, etc. Natural hazards are floods, storms, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions. Man-made hazards are the ones such as big industrial accidents, the tragic Fukushima incident that we saw after the tsunami in 2011. And the basic idea is that, okay, natural hazards are hazards that are caused naturally. But here I'd like to say that, in fact, there are purely natural hazards, such as an earthquake. The geophysical hazards, let's say, really difficult to prevent them from happening. But when we start thinking about climate-related hazards, which are categorized under natural hazards, but we all know that human activity has influenced since the Industrial Revolution the climate. And this is why the global temperature is rising. And this is why the intensity and frequency of what we still call natural hazards are getting more and more challenging. So we do need to question ourselves, are these really purely natural hazards, or let's say semi-man-made?
No, I absolutely agree with you. And of course, as time goes on, it strikes me that the differentiation between natural and man-made hazards is going to become more complicated, yeah. For sure. I mean, you mentioned the Sendai Agreement, which of course is extraordinarily important in the work you do. And in thinking about your role, can you tell us a little bit more about the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, and maybe a little about its mandate and how it fits in with the rest of the UN systems landscape?
Well, thank you. 2015 was a great year for multilateralism. If we look back 6 years ago, this was a year when we got the Paris Agreement in December. Before that, the Sustainable Development Goals. But the first of the global agreements of that year was in March 2015, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. And this is a really important agreement, although not as well known as the others, because there was a paradigm shift there. Until then, even though there were a lot of disasters, we were all saying, okay, let's try to manage disasters better. This is about responding after disaster strikes and makes our lives difficult and kills people. Sendai Framework said, no, we have to make a paradigm shift from managing disasters to managing disaster risk, like I just mentioned. So it's about prevention. It's about building resilience before we are hit by a disaster, and also at the same time reducing intensity and frequency of disaster itself. The other thing is that Sendai Framework says the essence of all of this is not to create new risks and to reduce existing risks. So the mandate of the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction is to support member states, but actually all stakeholders, including the private sector, the NGOs, and every citizens, so that they are having a better life, not being threatened by risk. And it's connected deeply with the Paris Agreement, because 90% of the major disasters that we've seen in the past 20 years are related to climate crisis. And it's very connected to the SDGs, because we know that nothing undermines development like a disaster. COVID-19 is the perfect tragic example.
No, I absolutely. And I was just thinking when you were talking about that, of course, you're interacting with many different countries, with many different risk management systems. That must be quite a challenge, actually.
It is quite a challenge because, as I mentioned, our role is to support all UN member states to implement the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, to be more preventative and to build resilience against disasters. But there are 193 member states, as you know, and you have the least developing countries, you have the small island developing states, and you have these countries which are so vulnerable that they do not have the resources, financial nor human, in order to really implement what they need to do to be more preventative. But when you think about it, it's not only the developing countries, because this summer, what we have seen in Europe, the floods, what we're seeing in the United States, the heat waves in Canada, disaster is really, striking every country. Of course, the way that it impacts people in countries are different depending on the country's development progress. But the truth is that, excuse me, we are actually supporting all member states around this. And it has become disaster risk reduction agenda for all, sadly, and especially now with COVID. Because, Robin, biological hazard, the pandemic, epidemic, this was written into the Sendai Framework 6 years ago. 6 years ago, when the member states got together in Sendai, Japan, and agreed on this document, many of them, especially those which had experienced Ebola and MERS and SARS, said the next big disaster is a pandemic. So we really do need to make sure that biological hazards does not wreak havoc. 6 years on, we are in where we are.
Absolutely, absolutely. I couldn't possibly agree more. And one has to ask what sort of practices that were carried out to get ready for some of these issues, and whether or not we are continuing to be able to get ourselves ready for the next one. And your work is, of course, absolutely crucial to that. Now, of course, part of the way in which we try to get ready, and the focus really of this discussion is about data and evidence. And I was just wondering what you see the role of data and evidence is in disaster risk reduction.
So it's really at the core of what we're talking about, disaster risk reduction, because I don't want to bore you too much about what the Sendai Framework says, but it's important that it has 4 priorities of action. And the first one is we need to understand the nature of risk that surrounds us. Because if we don't, we can't prevent them, right? Now, this needs data and evidence. And this means that we need to have data that is, on one part, the historic data. You need to know historically what are the kind of hazards that your country, your region, your community has been exposed to. And you have to be able to prevent yourself better from that. But you also need data for the future probabilistic things, such as how is the climate crisis going to affect my region, my country in 20 years from now? How is the growth of population going to expand the exposure? And then again, how do we prevent ourselves under that kind of different circumstances? So if we don't have enough data, then we cannot make the right policies. And that is the role of data and evidence in disaster risk reduction. That is why there is such an important role for science and technology in the implementation of the Sendai Framework. That is why it is so important that policy and science are really communicating to each other.
I think you make a very good point, particularly on the historical context here. I mean, I can remember after the terrible Fukushima incident in the UK, we asked ourselves, well, do we get tsunamis? Because, of course, we are not prone to them in the ways that Japan has. And then when we look back in the history, we realized that actually they have happened in the UK, but it was so far back in our history that it's sort of, the context is lost. Yeah. So I think, that was a really very important point that you made. And perhaps we can unpack that a little bit more about, where does the evidence come from, and how do you source it? I mean, as a UN agency, I guess you have access to an incredible amount of resource, or maybe not.
Yes, we do. And when I say we, not only the UN system, but I think that we are living in an age of, a positively more open source data society, where you have data which are available from the very high tech to the low tech. High tech, for example, the the Earth observation satellites that can really tell us a lot about flood modeling and issues like that. It's very important. But then at the same time, the data that we need is not only high tech, because as I mentioned, risk is about the hazard, the exposure, and the vulnerability. So if you take the vulnerability, how do we know where are the vulnerable groups of people and what other needs are? That data, and especially the disaggregated data, is more in the communities. When I say disaggregated data, it means that the data disaggregated by sex, by age, by income, people living with disability, indigenous people, displaced people, because again, disasters affect all of us if we're in that spot, but not in the same way. So you need all this kind of data. The challenge is, Robin, how do you really put together that data? Because there's a lot of sources, but many times, we talk about silos, but there are silos in data as well. So how do you put together that data? But the other question is, it's not enough to put together the data, right? Because data literacy, it's not an easy thing. You need to be able to translate that data into policy. And for that, you need capacity development, which does not always, is happening in all countries. Again, in the least developed countries and other developing countries. So you need to bring together all that data from different sources. You need to create a literacy for data. And for that, what we really think is important is that we need to strengthen the national statistics offices of the countries more. And importantly, they need to be linked up better with the keepers of data in the cities and the communities. Because many times again, these data about vulnerability, the data around disaggregation, the national government doesn't have it. It is, as you know, really, owned by the cities and the communities. So we need to bring this all together. But for this, we need to invest more in the national statistics offices, which sadly is not the case always, even in the developed countries. So I would really say that, that is a challenge about all the data that we need and we need to apply.
That's right. I mean, it's about assurance. How do we assure that the quality of the data you talked about, access to the data, that we've got the data that's necessary to deal with the problem at hand, and of course, it's different every time.
Yeah.
In the chat, by the way, there's been an interesting question. Does UNDR work solely at the multilateral level, and how is change enacted down at the grassroots level?
So that's a very good question, because at the end of the day, what we need to do is really help the countries on the ground. So we do it ourselves. We have regional offices which work with the disaster management authorities of the different countries. Basically, all countries by now have a disaster management authority. And many times they are tasked with both responding to, but also trying to prevent disaster risk from becoming a disaster. We work with them so that they can collect better data. We work with them so that the country has multi-hazard risk assessment plans. And importantly, we work with the country so that they have a national strategy and a local strategy for disaster risk reduction. But UNDRR is quite a small agency, so we work with the whole of the UN system, because now risk and disaster is about every sector, isn't it? So we work with FAO in terms of agricultural sector. We work with UN Women in order to empower the women in terms of disaster risk management. And importantly, there is a country team in most of the vulnerable countries of the world. So these country teams and the resident coordinators that we call are the ones that we work with daily so that they can help the governments, and not only the governments, but the stakeholders in the countries to make risk-informed decisions around development.
And, you know, a lot of what you've been talking about and here, and thank you, by the way, to whoever asked that question. Do keep those questions coming, please. A lot of what you've talked about is about a systems approach to dealing with risk management and the sort of response to disasters when they occur. And of course, many of them are cascading impacts, aren't they? You know, they start with one thing. You know, you have a tsunami, the tsunami leads to issues of power, the power leads to et cetera, and that must make it very difficult. Yes, it's very difficult, because in 2019, Robin, we issued the Global Assessment Report for Disaster Risk Reduction 2019, which is the flagship report about risk in the UN system. And the main theme was systemic risk, and we talked about it. But the first challenge was people thought, what are you talking about? Systemic risk? Because until then, and even, let's say, until recently, countries were looking at risk by a hazard by hazard approach. They said, okay, a hurricane might come. This is what we need to do. Okay, we are prone to earthquakes. This is what we need to do. But COVID-19 changed this, because everybody saw what systemic risk means. It means, as you just said, one thing leads to another. A public health crisis very quickly turning into a socio-economic global crisis, which has and is still impacting each and every sector of our lives. I think the silver lining, if there is, of the COVID-19 is the fact that people now understand that the risk that surrounds us, the contemporary nature of risk, is systemic. It's nothing new, but it's systemic, and the impact is cascading. So the next thing that we need to do is that we also need to have a systemic response to the systemic risk. Are we there? Not really. We have started to, understand that yes, this is systemic, but a systemic response really needs a risk governance in each and every country and city to really cut down the silos and have a multi-hazard, multi-sectoral approach. And I think this will happen. It is happening, but if we don't, take this opportunity, I mean, that would be another tragedy. We always say, let's not waste any disasters, right? An opportunity comes out from a disaster. We need to take advantage from this tragedy, at the least. And of course, when you say let's not waste a disaster, I think it's also, and let's remember our disasters as well. It always amazes me how quickly we forget what happens and don't keep the lessons that we've been learning at the forefront of our minds. And I guess part of your work is to try to get people to implement those into policy making and continue to think about that. Exactly. So that is the difficult thing, isn't it, Robin? Because human nature wants us to forget about terrible things that happened to us. You want to think, okay, that was a once in 100-year event, and it's not going to happen for another 100 years. But guess what? Just the other day, the Hurricane Ida,
it's so uncanny, but it happened on the same day as Hurricane Katrina. And it didn't take 100 years for it to come back. The important thing here for us not to forget is to really not only to remember, but to understand the benefit of prevention, the benefit of managing disaster risk. This is about putting $1 more into your infrastructure so that it is more resilient. This is about putting $1 more into your business so that your supply chain is more resilient. We used to see it as a cost. And as long as we see it as a cost, there will be always people who want to try to cut it. But we need to look at it as a benefit, as an opportunity. And here again, I think data and evidence is so important, because if we don't have convincing data and evidence that says, look, there is really a cost benefit. And again, I shouldn't call it a cost, but there's really here a solid reason why we need to invest into prevention. Then I think people will be looking into the bright side of putting money into it.
I mean, I think, so we've just had a question in the chat, and I want to read it out, although actually I think you have answered part of it already, but I just think it's such a good question. What is the governmental or cultural shift that needs to take place to deal with cascading systemic risk? Is this possible in resource-constrained countries? And I think you've answered part of that, but I just think that trying to convince governments is really an incredible challenge. But with UN at the front of your title there, I think that really helps get attention from governments. I wonder whether you'd like to reflect on that.
Right. Well, thank you, Robin. I mean, that's our role, isn't it? To really come up with, and not ourselves alone, but working with science and working with academia and technology and even the private sector on coming up with evidence, convincing argument that governments need to make policies in a certain way, which in my case is in a risk-informed way. I would say that for governments to be more responsive and more preventative from systemic risk is have a multi-hazard approach. That's the first one. I already mentioned this, but COVID-19 again is an example, great one, because during this COVID time, many countries have been hit by different disasters related to the climate crisis or even issues like earthquake. Second, governments need to have a multi-sectoral approach. It's not good enough, and sadly, this is happening in many countries, to create a disaster management authority and say, okay, you do the job. That's not it. The disaster management authority's job is to make sure that each and every ministry, agency in the government, whatever sector it is dealing with, looks at risk as a core issue of its policy making. And the other thing that it's really important for governments to do is to adopt what we call the whole of society approach, which is in the Sendai Framework. Sendai Framework says risk is everybody's business. So we need to have a whole of society approach. What does it mean? When you make the policy, governments shouldn't try to make it on their own. They should invite the stakeholders from the beginning, the private sector, the academia, the science and technology, and importantly, the vulnerable groups of people, because they know how vulnerable they are and what their needs are, and make the policy through what we call a national platform and make it into a national strategy. If a policy is made in this way, it will be convincing, it will be implemented. That's what we call whole of society approach. And that's what we try to help governments with. And actually, Robin, interestingly, some developing countries are better in doing this because they are so limited with resources. So to give you an example, a lot of countries don't deal with disaster risk reduction and climate adaptation, although they're very close, and sustainable development, both leading to it together. But in a lot of Pacific Island states, they have a ministry which deals with all of it together because they are so lacking of resources. So they look at adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and they combine it, and they make sure that development policy is informed by both. And there's one ministry that is in charge of this. And this helps because in a lot of developed countries, because there are more resources, there's a ministry for environment, there's a ministry for disaster management, and there's a ministry for economic policy, and they may not talk to each other. So the lack of resources in some instances almost help.
While you were saying that, it just made me think actually that I wonder how much we exchange people. It is such a national issue, this, that I just wonder to what extent people from different countries spend time with each other, swapping, exchanging.
Oh, a lot of time, actually. A lot of time, Robin, because what is the best way to understand what your challenge is and understand what the solutions are is through peer learning. The great example is the peer learning of the cities. So again, I think COVID-19 has highlighted that a lot of times the cities and the communities, the local are really struggling with disasters and preventing. We've seen this with the COVID too. And cities have also struggled a lot with risk from climate change. So a lot of cities get together, share their learning, and one of the role that we play is to provide that platform. So we have regional platforms in each of the 5 regions. We have what we call a global platform. The last one we had was in 2019 here in Geneva. Around 4,000 people come together, but importantly, it's not only the governments, it's all the stakeholders, and they share the stage, they share the panel, they share their learning and training. And I think, that is, as you mentioned, the best way to learn about your issues and learn about how to overcome it. And that, I think, has become a standard thing. And sometimes, you can even learn from developing countries, as I just mentioned. And sometimes talking about data or evidence, it's not only the high tech, but you learn from the indigenous way that some countries have been preventing disasters throughout centuries. So there's a lot of learning that can be done horizontally.
Well, that's a key facilitating role that you have there, which will only grow more important, as of course the ability to exchange data.
Yeah,
I mean that's often quite a challenge, isn't it?
It is quite a challenge, isn't it? And I think it's not only between countries, but it's also between sectors. To give you a good example, so early warning, early action really saves lives. Early warning systems that are, again, multi-hazard saves lives. But if the data or the warning, the information is not really standardized within a region, sometimes it's not good enough, because within the region or sub-region, when a hurricane strikes, when a drought strikes, it's not contained within the border of a certain country. So the standardization of data and also the way to apply it also needs to be shared. And I think this way of working more in the sub-region or the region is becoming more and more prominent.
And going back to sort of ways of trying to convince governments, of course, you know, example of good practice there, maybe the meteorological offices who I think do exchange. There's another question that's come in, which says, what are the success stories in prevention and resilience? We only hear about the disasters. Isn't that a very human thing? Yeah. You know, if it all goes well, it doesn't make the news headlines, does it? Exactly. It only makes the news headlines if it's dreadful. Exactly. What would you were success stories?
Right. So there's one very good success story, Bangladesh. Bangladesh is a country that is really exposed to frequent cyclones from the 1970s or even before. In the 1970s, there was a huge cyclone that actually killed, it's not sure, but something between 300,000 to maybe even 1 million people, right? Same cyclone of the same ferocity was again came to Bangladesh in 2020. Now, this time, the number of people who sadly were killed was around the hundreds. And why? Because Bangladesh did learn from its experience. It really established an early warning system, but importantly, educated the people to act early. So early warning, early action. They constructed shelters, and they also developed funding for climate catastrophe using their own domestic resources. So that is a success story. And actually, the most recent one is the one that we just saw in New Orleans. Now, this time, Hurricane Ida, very powerful, but the number of the mortality was very low. I think, almost nil. And this is because after Hurricane Katrina, they invested in the preventative infrastructure from hurricanes and floods. So there are success stories, but again, we don't hear of them that much. And I don't think we have enough of them. We need to, that's exactly what we're trying to do always. And here again, we need the support of the scientific community and also the academia all around the world, because we want to we want to have more success stories, because if you don't have them, again, you can't convince people to invest in prevention, can you?
No, absolutely, and I think that's right. If things don't go wrong, it is more difficult to maintain the momentum. And one of the things that I believe is very important is practice. The idea that you have a scenario which you subject your system to hypothetically to try and see how it responds to that. And we were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, exactly. And we need that kind of scenario building and practicing, because the fact is that because of the systemic nature of risks that we're facing right now, unfortunately, we don't know exactly what are the issues that we will encounter, what we call the unknowns. And we do need to admit that, governments need to be bold enough to admit that we don't know everything that's going to happen. But of course, you can't keep on saying that, can you? And the only way to find out what are the unknowns and to find the solution is to have what you just mentioned, Robin, a practice, a scenario, and have a real practice involving, again, all the sectors, right? Because it's so systemic, and and look at, okay, this is what we didn't look into, and this is what we need to fix. But again, I think there what you need is not only a whole of government approach, but whole of society approach, because of the fact that risk is really everywhere.
And we've just had a question come in here, related in many ways. Is there a responsibility from Global North to support the Global South in resilience? Is this fragmented and dependent on the whims of government? What could be an ideal future look like?
Well, my short answer is absolutely. Now, the Sendai Framework has 7 global targets, like reducing mortality, affected people, affected infrastructure, economic loss. But importantly, there is one global target that says there has to be enhanced international cooperation for disaster risk reduction. And that was put in precisely because countries which do not have enough resources and need to invest in building their education, in building, in feeding people, many times prevention is not at the top of the agenda, although it should be, but it isn't, right? They need, let's say, extra money for capacity development. They need extra money for establishing risk-informed policies. So that should happen. Sadly, it's not that enhanced yet. 13th of October is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction every year. And we focus on one of the Sendai Framework targets every year. This year, we're focusing on the one that I specifically mentioned. And the other thing is, Robin, we know that the Paris Agreement, and Paris Agreement is a legal document, right? It says that the Global North has to provide annually $100 billion to the Global South for climate climate mitigation adaptation. And that is not happening. If this is not happen, we really can't accomplish these global agenda. So we have to do it. And unfortunately, COVID-19 has really made our challenge even bigger, but that's why we have to make our efforts even bigger.
No, absolutely. You know, we've talked a lot about the systemic nature of hazards and the risks. And of course, what you're talking about there is the systemic nature of our world. We have to help each other because we all live in this system together.
Yes.
And it's a system of systems. So yeah, absolutely. So somebody's asked this this question. This is always a really tough one. I always think.
Okay.
If you could make governments take on one piece of advice, what piece of advice would that be?
I would say it's all about risk governance. It's all about, and what does it mean? It means about putting risk, the element of risk, into every decision you make, whether it's an economic decision or a decision related to more of a social one or political one even. Put risk in every decision-making process. And if you do that, that is called good risk governance. If you haven't, that is bad risk governance. We have seen in COVID-19 countries which did, well, COVID-19 is so complicated. Maybe we can't have a league table yet, right, of which country did best or better or whatnot. But still, we have seen that, at different stages, yes, but better risk governance, better results. So risk governance is the key, and that is about risk-informed policy making.
I mean, I think that's fantastic. That's a fantastic summary, and that's such a difficult question. That one always. What is the one thing? There are so many things, actually,
yeah.
And so we are coming to the end of our time. We've got just a minute and a half left, and I just wondered whether or not perhaps you could think of some last thoughts
Right.
that you want to share with us, as perhaps you want others outside. It's all been asking you what you're doing. Maybe you want to reflect on what everybody else should be doing.
Yeah. Well, the one thing that I wanted to just mention is the leave no one behind issue. So SDGs, Paris Agreement, Sendai Framework, this is all about leave no one behind. And especially in the case of disaster risk reduction, if we manage to have a policy, if we manage to have implementation of agenda, leaving no one behind, then everybody will be safe. COVID has told us we're not safe until everybody is safe. So leave no one behind is not only about humane, moral issues. It's also about really making the whole of our planet a safer place for everybody. So leave no one behind.
Excellent. Thank you very much indeed. It's been a real pleasure.
Thank you very much, Robin. And thank you once again for inviting me. Pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you to Mami Mizutori and Robin Grimes for this insightful discussion. As we head into our lunch break, now might be the perfect time to dive into the INGSA 2021 Viewpoints collection to read more on the thought-provoking issues raised across the conference. These short companion pieces provide key snapshots of where the field of science advice is right now and where it is heading. We will be back in 45 minutes. Thank you to the Université of Montreal's Big Band, for providing the music during the break. See you soon.